All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin our seminar, CCGS seminar for today. Just when we come to this topic about WeChat, I can't help but to recall the time when I got my first intelligent phone. So I came to Australia. I mean, the last place to come to get an intelligent phone was in Australia. And probably one of the very first apps that I downloaded was WeChat. Okay, I used lots of social media in the past, and I used Viber, I used WhatsApp. Probably from Singapore background, we tend to be more familiar with WhatsApp than others. But eventually, kind of like all my social accounts just went off, and I left only WeChat. And that shows how pervasive this app has become in our daily lives. And today we have with us Fran Martin, one of our very own researchers at the University of Melbourne, to come to talk to us about WeChat usage amongst Chinese women in the community in Melbourne. So just a very quick introduction of Fran. Fran did her BA and PhD at the University of Melbourne. She taught a bit at La Trobe before she was appointed the Associate Professor and Reader in Cultural Studies at the University of Melbourne. And her best-known works includes topics on television, film, literature, the internet culture, and other forms of cultural production in contemporary transnational Chinese cultural sphere. She's very fluent in Chinese, so try not to speak Chinese in front of her in case you want to say anything bad. But I'm sure she's a very nice person, and there's nothing bad to say about her. Yeah, and one thing that struck me when I read her CV is that she is a funding magnet. She is she's holder of 3 ARC grants and 1 linkage. I think I wish I had her kind of CV, honestly. That is amazing. Okay, without getting too much of her airtime, I will. That's all I'm going to introduce about Fran, but her credentials actually goes way beyond what I have said. So without further ado, Fran.
Thank you for that very generous and kind and exaggerated introduction, especially on the grants. That's lovely. And thanks also to the Centre for Contemporary Chinese Studies for inviting me to give this talk, which is a lovely opportunity, particularly to the director, Professor Christine Wong. So I'm going to start with a slide, see if this works. Yeah, I'm sorry, some of the images and text I'm going to show today are a little disturbing, but I'm showing them in the interests of a kind of scholarly investigation, obviously, into a few related questions. I guess my keywords today are media, transnationalism, and multiculturalism, right? Thinking through the relationship between those 3 ideas and practices in relation to the specific case of Chinese international students in Melbourne in the current period. Yeah, that may be AV. That's great. Right, well, that shows up much better. Thank you. So I am, because it's a kind of a longish paper and I have a tendency to run on, I'm going to read mostly and I'll look forward to getting more interactive in question time. So the poster we see here appeared in May last year in 2016. It's an anonymous poster, and it was attached to a post near the entry to a building in inner North Melbourne on Swanston Street, just around the corner, a building which is used by the Trinity College Foundation Studies program, which some international undergraduate students, including those from China, must take in order to gain admission to the University of Melbourne, or they had to take that program at last year anyway, that was still in place. So with its simplified Chinese text reading, "Danger, African criminals," accompanied by photographs of unidentified but hostile-looking African heritage young men, and assertions that such young men target Chinese students in order to rob them and bash them, the photograph we see here was circulated after being kind of attached to the post. It then was circulated widely in the international and particularly Chinese student community via WeChat, which is currently, as we've just heard in the introduction, the most popular social media platform arguably in China itself and certainly within this community, where it fed into a stream of posts and news stories that had been running since February concerning the alleged targeting of Chinese students by African gangs in a spate of smartphone thefts in this area, Carlton and the kind of southern Carlton and the northern CBD. So in light of its fairly obvious racial vilification, its photographic accusation of unidentified people, and the doubt cast on the efficacy of the police, unsurprisingly the poster was swiftly removed by officers of the Victoria Police. This poster, I would suggest, seems to point towards hostile engagements which are allegedly physical but definitely rhetorical between two specific ethnic groups within inner Melbourne's urban multiculture. On the one hand, African migrants, and on the other hand, Chinese international students. So what is happening here? What led to this poster being produced and displayed and circulated? And I guess the intellectual question I'm getting at through this talk is, are our current interpretive frameworks and apparatuses really adequate or up to the task of accounting for what's going on here, or making scholarly interventions into the situation that produces this poster? And that's what I'm wanting to tackle in speaking with you today. So in order to do that, I'm going to first do a little academic detour through some theories of everyday multiculturalism. So since the 1990s, a thread of critical work from scholars largely in Australia and Britain has problematised the top-down accounts of official multiculturalism that have been prescribed in these nations at different times by governments, by giving attention instead to the embodied material practices of living with cultural diversity on the ground. So kind of ethnographic approaches to everyday life, particularly in cities, in a turn to what has been called everyday multiculturalism. So in John Stratton's germinal account in his book Race Days, he introduces the concept like this. So I won't kind of bore you by reading it out, but I've highlighted the main part there in yellow. So everyday multiculturalism is how cultures produced by individuals in their everyday lives merge, creolise and transform as people live their lives. And they adapt and resist situations. Notice it's not kind of overwhelmed by love, joy and happiness necessarily. There could be misunderstanding, loving and hating, and taking pleasure in other people with whom they come into contact. In Australia, scholars took up the everyday multiculturalism rubric to produce enriched understandings of the unspectacular daily business of living in diversity in a cultural climate where multiculturalism itself, as a policy, the top-down kind, has come under renewed attack from the re-emergence of Hansenism, intensifying Islamophobia, and moral panics about ethnic gangs of various kinds. So referencing Stephen Vertevek's conceptualisation of what he called super diversity in Britain, Australian scholar Greg Noble characterises everyday life in Australian cities with reference to a related kind of diversification of diversity. And here's his account of that. An evolving hyperdiversity, he calls it, not just that people are living hybrid lives or that they're living them in polyethnic neighbourhoods, but that complexity and the subsequent forms of interaction are such that they go beyond typical understandings of multiculturalism and correspond to the claim that diversity itself is becoming more diverse. There's just kind of more complexity in play, I guess. But I've highlighted two elements of Noble's formulation here for the reason that I think, first, they characterise much work, much recent work on everyday multiculturalism in Australia. And secondly, because the case study that I'm going to talk about today presents, I think, a potential challenge to each of them. So first of all, as a precondition for the emergence of hyperdiversity, Noble cites the concept of hybrid lives there. So this concept of hybridity appears often in the work of Australian scholars in their collective emphasis on culturally and ethnically mixed cultures, particularly among 1.5 and second and third generation migrant youth. So there's a whole slew of work examining the way in which cultures and subjectivities hybridise and creolise in those particular cohorts, so 1.5 migrant generations and beyond. So as a great example of that kind of approach is Anita Harris's important work on young people and everyday multiculturalism in Australian cities. This is a very productive kind of use of the concept, I think, but it also typifies the kind of focus of a lot of this work. So young people personify the hybrid forms of new kinds of mixed cultural identities. That is, third, second and 1.5 generation youth complicate multicultural policy that requires neat kind of separations between ethnic groups because they hybridise, as we know. It's certainly a correct statement. Secondly, though, if we just go back to Noble's original formulation here, we see also the polyethnic neighbourhood as another precondition for Australian hyperdiversity and a key site for research on everyday multiculturalism. So I'm interested in the way we're underlining here the neighbourhood, which I think in many ways is a very productive focus for work on what's happening in contemporary culture, you know, a local geographical focus. I take that focus myself in other papers. And it's a logical focus because everyday multiculturalism, after all, is based on analysing the cultural complexity of people's everyday engagements. And where do they happen? They kind of happen at the local level often. And much work on everyday multiculturalism in Australia has focused, therefore, on territorially bounded sites, so limited territories that relate to local communities, specific neighbourhoods, schools, community organisations, and so on, bounded sites. So while I hope that my framing of the works of the scholars I've just cited, who I greatly admire and respect, makes clear that I'm not arguing with their emphases on hybrid identities and specific localities as very productive sites for research on everyday multiculturalism. Nevertheless, in order to account effectively for examples like the one I'm analysing here, I would argue that we need to go further. So first, I propose that it's important to supplement attention to hybrid identities among permanent migrants with studies of interactions involving more recently arrived first-generation and transient migrants, including international students. If we think about the city of Melbourne, there are currently around 55,000 international students just from China, the largest group currently as residents in the city, and I don't think that's a group we should ignore. So one of the key points in Vertevec's original conceptualisation of superdiversity is precisely the diversification of migration statuses. In other words, permanent migrants living alongside transient migrants like students and guest workers, and established second and third generation migrants living together with ever-renewing waves of more recent arrivals. So even while 1.5 plus migrant generations undeniably do mix, hybridise and render problematic the concept of discrete ethno-bounded cultures, this hybridisation is not universal, right, across all groups, or at least not in the same way in super diverse societies. Instead, we see the coexistence of multiple migrant generations, including relatively recently arrived first generation and transient migrants, who, as we will see, at times, and not everyone of course, but some, may believe rather strongly in the existence and the importance of categorical ethnic definitions, such as Chinese identity or another identity that one might have coming from a different nation. And in the case of transient migrants, may not have time or may not have yet had time at any given moment to mix and hybridise to the same extent as permanent migrants and their succeeding generations. So second, I want to propose that we need to supplement existing conceptualisations of multiculturalism with a much stronger appreciation of the transnational character of people's everyday experience. We can't treat the neighbourhood as if it's a bounded space to the same degree as perhaps we're used to doing. The extant everyday multiculturalism scholarship's emphasis on territorially bounded places at times risks the implication that everydayness, the character of the everyday, equates to the geographic scale of the immediate locality. Yet today, perhaps especially for migrant communities of various kinds, the terrain of everyday life is in fact often strongly translocal as much as geolocal. So that to think about everyday multiculturalism should be, ipso facto in those cases, to think about translocality, like a locality here relating to another locality that's overseas, or more than one locality elsewhere. As Michael Peter Smith, who's an urban studies professor, has argued in his elaboration of the method that he calls transnational urbanism, the everyday needs to be freed from its association with purely local phenomena. It doesn't work to approach cities as if they were just a bounded neighbourhood on the local scale. Thanks to the quasi-ubiquity of broadband connectivity, the ready availability of mobile communications technologies, the naturalisation of online digital communication in everyday life, and the decreased costs of international human travel, for the current generation of migrant young people in Australian cities, everyday life is thoroughly shot through with translocal connections, such that, in the words of geographer Ash Amin, we cannot assume that local happenings or geographies are ontologically separable from those out there. For a study like the one I'm undertaking, in which the research subject group is intensively networked through media and personal connections to people, texts and cultures located at a transnational remove from the context of their immediate habitation in Melbourne, I find a translocal approach like the one advocated by Smith, Amin and others extremely useful, because it enables us to see the everyday, in Smith's words, not as a sedentary, nostalgic site of local culture, but as a dynamic crossroads of local, national and transnational placemaking practices. So that the ways people experience the city, if you like, the ways people make the city through everyday practice are happening partly at a transnational as well as a local scale. And I think that thinking this way, I hope, can kind of do justice to the actual conditions of people's lives and their experiences of everyday life in super diverse societies. So that's my theoretical preamble. I'm about to get on to the interesting bit, the case study. Well, I'll first just a little mention of method. The material presented in my paper today is drawn from a 5-year longitudinal ethnographic study which is funded by the Australian Research Council and is still in progress now. So I'm 2 and a bit years into the 5-year study. I'm following a group of 56 female tertiary students from pre-departure in China through several years of study in Melbourne and on again to their post-graduation destinations. So the purpose in doing this is really to develop an in-depth understanding of the social and subjective world of this group of students at the micro level of their everyday experiences in Melbourne. In this paper, I'll be drawing here and there on several different data sources, including recorded and unrecorded interviews with my participants and their families, and other future international students and commercial international education agents in China in June, July 2015. Also, a series of ongoing conversations with participants between July 2015 and now, both face-to-face and through social media, and sometimes recorded, but usually not, in which they discuss their everyday experiences in Melbourne. Also, 25 months of observations of participants' posts on WeChat, and my discussions also with a number of other informants, including some members of Melbourne's Chinese diasporic community, or migrant community, people involved at various levels in the production of WeChat local news media, including some of my participants who write for public accounts themselves, representatives of Victoria Police, the University of Melbourne, and community groups providing services to refugees and multicultural youth in Melbourne. So now, no, wait a minute. Not that slide yet, sorry. Despite common stereotypes, both within Australia's international education industry and in media accounts, that construct Chinese international students as insular and as not amenable to cultural mixing and exchange, I want to start off my case study by saying that, in fact, that may not be quite that simple. If we look at the pre-departure moment, in fact, Australia's multicultural society is one of the nation's major drawcards as a study destination for Chinese students. in the pre-departure sessions that I attended in 2015 in China, both by universities and by commercial education agents. Australia's multiculturalism was cited every time as a major draw card in the list of the attractions of the country, both by education industry professionals and then later on in my interviews with future students and their parents as well. One future student who introduced herself to me at a university-run pre-departure session even said she was especially interested in participating in my study because, as an undergraduate in Hangzhou, she herself had conducted a study into the everyday experience of African international students on her home campus. So, already thinking about those issues. Following their arrival in Melbourne, while many of my participants have found it difficult to make local friends, which the word for local is 当地的朋友, but I think 当地 kind of means Caucasian friends in common usage, even though Chinese friends might be local as well. I think they're meaning non-Chinese or Caucasian friends. Despite that, some have developed friendships and in some cases romantic relationships with a wide range of other, particularly East and Southeast Asian international students, including people from Taiwan, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, India, Vietnam and Japan. One young woman, in fact, finding herself one of just 2 Chinese students in her course at a campus in Melbourne's outer north, developed close friendships with a group of Muslim women studying with her. One from Syria, one from Turkey, and one from Tasmania, an Anglo-Celtic woman who is married to a Muslim man and had converted to Islam. She said, "I often look around when we're having lunch and find I'm the only one not wearing a hijab." She was kind of joking, but she was sort of pleasantly surprised by this unexpected turn in the ethno-cultural composition of her friendship group. She told me how she enjoyed learning about her Muslim friends' religion and cultural traditions and admires their studiousness and ambition. Another participant, already resident in Melbourne for several years, had a romantic relationship with an international postgraduate student from Ghana, which she didn't mention to her parents because she told me they would object to her dating somebody with black skin or dark skin. 2 other participants, friends who are studying social work and early childhood education, have learned a lot about multiculturalism and Indigenous culture and politics from their coursework, and in our conversations make fluent reference to concepts like internalised racism and white privilege. Another student, more recently arrived, speaks forthrightly, there she is, about how her experience of the multicultural classroom in her English language class that she had to take before her university enrolment and her new friendships with Saudi and Indian classmates have changed her former view of certain nationalities, which had been influenced by negative discourse from the Chinese state, based largely on current political disputes. Note she highlights the Philippines there. So clearly enough, not only is multiculturalism a significant draw card for Chinese students coming to study in Australian cities, but once they're here, many of them do make extremely significant cross-cultural engagements and, as a result, develop varying levels of reflexivity regarding national and cultural identity. Indeed, it was through a reflexive critical engagement with questions of ethnicity and media representation that I first became aware of the unfolding events that form my major case study in this paper. In early March last year, I arranged one of my project's regular group activities, an evening film screening. It was a film screening of the film Hanging Rock, because we were picnic at Hanging Rock because we were going to go to Hanging Rock for a picnic the next week, so I thought, let's watch the film. That was on the University of Melbourne's campus in the John Medley building, in fact. So I organised these activities, or I did in the first 18 months of the project, to cement social relationships with my participant group and to afford additional opportunities for participant observation. Before the screening that evening, one of my participants, Nio Nio, who's it's a pseudonym, of course, for a 24-year-old master's student from Sanmenxia in Henan, sent me a WeChat message saying that there was something urgent that she hoped to discuss with me and perhaps we could talk about it at the screening. But she didn't say what it was. So that evening I met at the venue with 9 of my participants and about 8 additional people, mainly other Chinese international students who also wanted to see the film, and we ate sushi together and chatted together before the screening. Nyo brought up with the whole group what was bothering her. She said, "You know all these stories on WeChat lately about African gangs attacking Chinese students? Well, I'm wondering whether they're really true or not, or whether they might be a media beat-up." This was actually the first I'd heard of the matter, but I kind of acted cool and let her keep talking. I didn't know about it till she mentioned it that day. She went on to describe how she had followed up on each of the stories she'd seen currently circulating and contacted anyone she could who was connected with the stories, only to find that although everyone seemed to know someone who knew someone who had been mugged, she couldn't at that point find any direct eyewitnesses or any of the actual people who had allegedly been attacked. So she's a very critically thinking young woman and was feeling very suspicious about the stories. She suspected it was a beat-up. Harmful, she said, both to interethnic relations and to Chinese students' sense of safety. Other participants in our conversation were less reflexive and sceptical than Nyo, simply fearing for their own safety, especially since some of the WeChat news accounts linked reader reports of muggings with the stories of a recent home invasion and car theft by an African gang in the eastern suburbs, which you probably remember. There was a spate of news in the local media about carjackings and home break-ins around that time last year. Over the following days, though, many further stories of Chinese students being mugged in the university environs by groups of tall, fast, black youths, as they were described, came in thick and fast on WeChat. This was both in our dedicated chat group for study participants, where we all talk, and also via WeChat's Facebook-like Moments feed, where I had at that point around 250 contacts in the wider Chinese student community. I saw a sense of panic setting in, with many students stating that they daren't go out alone at night in the Carlton and City area, and some reporting that people they knew now directly, flatmates, classmates and friends, had been robbed and had had very underwhelming experiences with reporting thefts to the police, who appeared to them to not really do anything. They just make a note and tell you to go away. So this culminated on the night of March 12th with the violent disturbance that took place in Federation Square on the night of the Moomba celebrations, which was widely reported, as I'm sure you remember, in local media as involving rival African and Pacific Islander gangs from Melbourne's disadvantaged outer east. WeChat Melbourne news accounts picked up the sensationalist stories from the local tabloid press, translated the headlines into Chinese, and in many cases exacerbated the racist cast of the reporting, adding photos of injuries sustained by ethnically Chinese people, and referring repeatedly, I'm just going to play a series of slides as I keep talking with translations, referring repeatedly to black gang members and black bandits out of control and targeting Asians, Yayi, or Chinese people, Huairen, and you'll see those terms probably in these slides. Chinese student groups at the University of Melbourne encouraged their members to contact the Chinese consulate to voice concern over whether the police and university were doing enough to protect their safety. Students' families back in China, where stories of the allegedly anti-Chinese crimes in Melbourne circulated freely online and via social media, sent panicked messages. One of my participants was even contacted by a former teacher she hadn't seen for many years, in her words, to check whether I'm still alive. Meanwhile, Victoria Police attempted, somewhat ineffectually given their complete lack of access to Chinese language media, or language skills it seems, to circulate a deracialising message that the muggings were not targeted at Chinese people specifically, they said, and that only 1/3 of the phone theft victims were of Asian heritage. Just after midnight on the night of the Moomba disturbance, Nyo posted a WeChat Moments linked to a story sourced from the Herald Sun, it might be this one, embellished with a Chinese headline that stated the city had become a battlefield with 200 armed gang members exchanging fire. So you see the exaggeration there. She commented though, and this is the woman who's very critical of the media initially, she commented, "Aye, it's true. Originally, I clung to my illusion that this was a beat-up by profit-driven media, but now the reality is staring me in the face. I have to accept it. The Sunday morning following the disturbance, I had another group activity planned. Several participants dropped out at the last minute. In fact, we were going to Hanging Rock to have our picnic. But even Nyo dropped out as well, citing fears. We were meeting at about, I don't know, 10:30 in the morning, but they dropped out citing fears about travelling from the CBD to Carlton in the morning in light of the events of the night before. So they're very fearful. In my discussions with participants over the weeks and months that followed since then and up until now still, it's clear that their levels of fear and insecurity in the city and the university area had significantly increased as a result of their consumption of WeChat stories about the activities of the so-called black gang members supposedly targeting Chinese students. Many reported then, and still say to me now, that they feel generically afraid of black people and are unwilling to encounter them in the street. I tend to cross to the other side or, try and get out of the area. The poster that I showed you at the beginning of this paper appeared and was circulated a couple of months later. And as I said, I think it can be seen as kind of linking closely to the events I'm describing now. So as you may have seen in the slides, the reports of events that students were reading via WeChat came not only from their personal moments feed or 朋友圈, where it was a bit like a Facebook feed, where friends post individual comments, photos and links, but also from their subscription to a range of official news accounts like this one, which I'm going to talk about. So usually these news accounts are produced by commercial media companies based in Melbourne or somewhere in Australia, and offer a daily digest of Chinese language news and information about life and events in specific Australian cities, sourced and translated from local media or written by stringers. Scores of such accounts exist, and they provide a key source of local news and information for international students and other members of the Chinese diaspora in Australia. In fact, I would go so far to say that among the students I've spoken to, WeChat local Melbourne news is the dominant source of news for Chinese students. And as I've said, these accounts also provide work for some students, particularly media studies students or students of communication who might work casually for them in writing content. For terrible pay, I must add. The official subscription accounts and individual personal WeChat communications exist in a symbiotic relationship. While individuals often post links to stories like this published in the official accounts in turn rely on user-produced content as a source of stories, presenting screenshots of users' posts, with permission I guess, or of users' messages and conversations in chat as eyewitness accounts of unfolding events. Now, subscription accounts of this type occupy a unique emerging place in both local and transnational media ecologies. WeChat is a Chinese-owned and run service. It's developed and owned by China's Tencent Holding Limited and is regulated almost wholly from the Chinese side. So, for example, state censorship of content applies so that even when operating in Australia, content producers self-censor to avoid criticism of China's government and of the Chinese Communist Party. Otherwise, their stories will be pulled and their editors may get in trouble. So it's regulated there. On the Australian side, meanwhile, these public subscription services tend to be somewhat insulated from Australian Commonwealth media regulation. For example, insulated from the effective enforcement of anti-racial vilification laws, political campaigning laws, and so on, due to the language barrier to Australian authorities. That insulation isn't total, and I've heard of cases of certain articles on WeChat public accounts coming to the attention of the Australian authorities, but it's rather rare. Somebody would have to, bring it to the attention of the Ombudsman and translate it and things. Right. However, despite that kind of lack of effective regulation by Australian law, in terms of content, accounts like Mel Today, Melbourne We Life and Mel Life, which are three of my participants' most commonly read accounts, present news and information that is almost wholly concerned with local current events in Melbourne. So in this sense, WeChat news subscription accounts occupy an emergent grey area, I think, between traditional ethnic media, on the one hand, and on the other hand, new forms of transnational media. Hence, I call them, in a rather awkward academic speak kind of way, ethno-transnational media. Like something that media studies scholar wrote about a decade and a half ago, Stuart Cunningham, who wrote about what he called ethno-specific mediatised spherules. That's basically opening the way for the rest of us to just make things like that up. Crazy terms, but it's specific in what he means. At the time he was writing, these ethno-specific mediatised spherules were instantiated in video, television, cinema, music and Web 1.0 platforms used by diasporic communities in Australia. Like those, these new media that I'm talking about too are probably most significant insofar as they provide users with sorely needed spaces of intra-diasporic communication, social support and minoritarian public sphere. So I'm not launching an attack on this kind of media. I think it's, as I said, I think its major function is a very positive function, a very necessary function. However, the new generation of social media services also has a number of new characteristics that, as we will see, arguably make its social effects more complex than the older media that were analysed by Cunningham 15 years ago. The importance of WeChat in Chinese international students' everyday lives cannot be overstated. Most of my participants keep the app open on their phones 24 hours a day and check their Moments feed and subscription accounts multiple times and for cumulatively significant periods of time every day and night. And now I've started doing that too. It's quite addictive. Their preference for sourcing aggregated news via mobile apps reflects a general trend both within and outside China. So in China, a 2016 study by Tencent shows that WeChat is among people's top sources for accessing news, especially via WeChat's official account service. So I'll show you some stats. There's from the 2016 Walk the Chat report on the company's performance. Since WeChat News in Melbourne is so easy to access, is tailored to the specific city and community in which students are living, and is written in students' first language, it becomes a truly ubiquitous guiding presence in their navigation of everyday life. For this generation, then, their everyday experience of local life in Melbourne is mediated with unprecedented intensity, I would say. Each of the Melbourne-based official accounts to which I and my research participants subscribe covered the incidents that I just outlined to some degree. It was all over everything for a month or two. But while some accounts made a genuine effort to disentangle fact from fiction and give readers a non-alarmist explanation of what happened on the night of March 12, one account stands out, in my view, for its extensive and highly sensationalist coverage of African gang stories, both before the Moomba events and ever since. Mel Today, or Melbourne, is among the largest and most widely read, there's some information, of the Melbourne-based news and information accounts operating across Weibo, WeChat, a web page and a dedicated phone app. Its top WeChat headline stories attract between 10,000 and 100,000 views, around 35,000 views per top story. In the Daily Digest is a rough average, I would say. And for context, there are currently, as I said earlier, about 55,000 students from China studying in Victoria. 35,000 clicks on average for a major headline news story. So it gives you some sense. In 2015, as we see here, Mel Today reported that it had over 150,000 followers on Weibo, over 50,000 on WeChat, with 7,000 to 8,000 ongoing monthly growth, and over 1 million monthly views from 250,000 unique visitors to its web page. Mel Today, registered as a share limited company in 2014, is part of the Media Today group, which was founded and directed by a young entrepreneur, Dapeng Rock Zhang, who's a graduate of UTS in Sydney, following his establishment of the similar Sydney Today service in 2010. The Today Group also runs accounts for Queensland and Adelaide, as well as separate accounts dedicated to Australian real estate, tourism and health. Mel Today, a successful commercial enterprise employing some 10 staff, including 5 reporters, uses tabloid-style headlines and images, as you've seen, soliciting attention-grabbing emotional responses, whether those are shock, astonishment, fear, outrage, patriotism to China, pathos, intrigue, and so on, to draw readers in, to click on stories on a range of topics that are deemed to be of interest to the Chinese community, especially immigration, investment, real estate, education, entertainment and crime. So in addition to the 5 paid reporters who gather stories from local media and other sources, unpaid readers also submit personal stories that they would like to see reported. In mid-2016, I had the opportunity to meet with one of the partners of Mel Today, who I'll call Mr. A. He's a young finance graduate from a prestigious Victorian university with a background in e-retail and marketing. And I spoke with him about the company's approach to news reporting. He told me that young people today want their news fast. They want it conveniently, they want it cheaply, and they want it in few words. And Chinese people prefer to have it in Chinese. And they need news media that will represent issues of particular concern for Chinese people, Huairen, to which the local media don't give a lot of attention, which is true, more or less. You know, there are specific, probably news needs for particular migrant and ethnic communities. Mr. A told me that whereas traditional news's higher budget gives it the advantage of in-depth reporting and systematic fact-checking, social media news's advantage is different. It doesn't lie in fact-checking, it lies in speed. Mel Today's fact-checking is minimal. It's usually confined to a simple internet Google search to ascertain whether reported events actually happened or not, and that's it. Its editors choose news topics based on an evaluation of their likely popularity. It's a familiar enough kind of commercial model of news provision in the digital era. The goal is to keep up traffic to the account since the operational model is wholly commercial, relying on the sale of space to advertisers whose value is based on traffic volume. Echoing other WeChat news account workers I've spoken with, Mr. A observed candidly that to keep the traffic up, the writers routinely take stories from the local press and, quote, just, exaggerate things a little bit for the headline. As well as this commercially driven sensationalism, the other thing I'd note about Mel Today's copy is that it's also marked by its really insistent use of the term Chinese people, Huairen, constructing Huairen heroes, Huairen crime victims, Huairen concerns and Huairen responses, Huairen areas of the city, and responses to current affairs, thus continually sort of reinforcing Chinese ethnic identity as both the linchpin of reader engagement and the lens through which local events are evaluated. The content of Mel Today is organically linked with local Australian media, with a preference for eye-grabbing material gleaned from News Corp and other tabloid sources. These local news producers' ongoing moral panics over African youth are duly reproduced and often embellished in Mel Today features. As well as these strong local links, the Today accounts are also transnationally networked into Sinophone Chinese-speaking communities worldwide, cited regularly by journalists covering Australian news across mainland China and Hong Kong. So with specific reference to Mel Today's reports on the African gangs topic, Mr. A emphasised to me that Mel Today's reporting did not directly incite inter-ethnic violence and was aimed mainly at keeping the Chinese community safe from crime. Interestingly, probably suspecting, I'm a sort of liberal, intellectual kind of person with certain political leanings, he was very thoughtful when he spoke with me on the issue of the social needs of the children of refugees from African nations, observing that what these youth really need is a stable life environment to keep them away from crime, and that the Australian government has a responsibility to provide that for them, which you'd have to kind of have some sympathy for that view. But despite these stated social concerns, it was clear from the overall tenor of our conversation that as a businessman, Mr. A's first concern was profit, delivering news with high clickability to guarantee advertising revenue. Of course, that's not idiosyncratic, but part of a broader trend towards the tabloidisation and infotainmentisation of journalism in deregulating commercial digital media environments the world over, as commentators have observed. Here, however, I would say we see a new permutation of this trend. Sensationalised local news delivered through a highly popular form of commercial transnational media that is somewhat insulated from content regulation in the jurisdiction where it operates, with concrete ramifications for that city's multicultural livability. As I noted earlier, overall I observed that continued exposure to sensationalist reporting on African gangs from Mel Today and other WeChat local news accounts tended to have the net effect of increasing Chinese students' mistrust of people they thought were African, eroding their sense of safety in public spaces of the city. Nevertheless, if we examine their responses to these events in a little bit greater depth, a more complex picture emerges. Many of my participants revealed a high degree of reflexivity in their consumption of media like Mel Today. It is known among readers as a deeply sensationalist platform. People told me, you don't read that one, that's a bad choice to get your news from. And many, as we saw above with Nyo Nyo, tended to approach its stories with a lot of scepticism. For example, a couple of months after the main wave of reports on phone thefts, one participant, Jiao Le, at that time 18, took a very calm, pragmatic approach to the issue, observing that in big cities like Guangzhou, where she comes from, such thefts occur all the time, every day, and yet are seldom reported on. Whereas what happens is Melbourne's Chinese community is so much smaller and so intensely networked that minor incidents quickly become known to everyone and panic readily sets in. So she wasn't scared about those things at all, taking that pragmatic view. Another participant, Ming Xi from Henan, who was 19, was part of a group of students enrolled in a joint program between a Chinese university and a university located in Melbourne's inner west suburb of Footscray. Now, when I interviewed Ming Xi with two of her classmates in Kaifeng pre-departure in 2015, they spontaneously expressed some unease about stories they'd heard that social order was lacking in Footscray. They'd heard that Footscray was Hanlan, because they said there are lots of Africans and Vietnamese people there. However, I'm pleased to say, when after several months living and studying in Footscray and following the wave of reports about phone thefts by African gangs, when I asked Ming Xi whether she was now more worried than before about her personal safety, she said, no, I'm not scared of Africans. She said, I mean, you see them in Footscray in the street all the time, but they're fine, they don't do any harm. So such a statement is hardly a shiny example of deep intercultural exchange and multi-ethnic harmony. However, as Christine Ho observes, the more modest goal of respecting the presence of others or recognition of the other's legitimate presence in a shared social space can also be seen as an indicator of workable everyday multiculturalism and may in some cases be a more realistic goal than harmony. Like most media consumers then, the Chinese students are no cultural dopes. They actively weigh reportage against the evidence of their own experience and accordingly temper their understanding of and response to social media news and the groups that it represents. So, in conclusion, I'll just speak for a couple of minutes in conclusion, I've tried to show how current conditions of superdiversity in cities like Melbourne mean that we need to tailor our approaches to everyday multiculturalism with attention not only to permanent migrants but also to the numerous transient and first-generation migrants who are ever present in the city. It's clear that the relatively recently arrived transient educational migrants who are my focus in this project do not exemplify, on the whole, generally, the deeply hybrid youth cultures found in the 1.5 plus generations. I should say that this changes depending on how long people stay, of course. If people stay for 6, 7, 8 years, friendship groups will shift and so on. But if we're talking about people who have come for tertiary study and only been here 1 or 2 or 3 years, largely that's a different group from the 1.5 generations that have been previously studied. Instead, these groups firmly self-identify largely as members of a discrete, non-hybrid ethnic, cultural and national group, Chinese, whether that's Huaren or Zhongguoren. And in the events I have dealt with here, they tended to figure other groups in a similar way, so that young men who may have been, who knows, 1.5 and second generation African-Australian youth were referred to often as Africans, whether that's Feizhouren or Fei, or simply black people, Heiren. Despite this, however, I would argue that even in this seemingly unpromising case, where arguments based on hybrid ethnic identities can't gain much purpose, the conflict in question still should not be seen as the product of ineluctable cultural differences between groups. To do so would be playing into the racism of some of the tabloid journalism we've been discussing. Rather, it can be seen to result from the material situation of the communities in question vis-à-vis multiple socioeconomic, micro-political and media-related factors pertaining to their specific urban context in Melbourne. In the case of the tall, dark-skinned youth who were alleged to have stolen phones from Chinese students, although Victoria Police revealed that in fact only 11 out of the 35 people arrested for these particular crimes were of African or African Middle East racial appearance, and a majority were of Caucasian appearance. Nonetheless, it's possible that if there were some of darker-skinned appearance, that some of those men may have been teenage children of former refugees from Sudan, South Sudan and the Horn of Africa, among the most severely disadvantaged residents of Australian cities based on multiple socioeconomic indicators. So if that is the case, hypothetically, very hypothetically, then surely it would be clear that their involvement in petty crime, if they were involved, would relate more to their material situation of social deprivation than to any ethno-cultural factors. You know, as though it's a sort of cultural norm for people from particular places to commit crimes. It's not, obviously not credible. With regard to responses to the incidents from Melbourne's Chinese community, as we've seen, although arguably these might build on a pre-existing kernel of anti-African racism, they probably do, but they were decisively shaped, in the examples I've given, less again by ineluctable cultural factors than by economic factors, specifically the exigencies of minimally regulated ethno-transnational commercial social media, which is pursuing a profit and presenting news as a product above any conception of media ethics. I've also been arguing that our approaches to everyday multiculturalism need to be enhanced by an appreciation of how people's everyday lives are increasingly shaped by translocal media connections. For the ethno-transnational media available to diasporic communities today is quite different to what was available just a decade or so ago. And as I hope my case studies demonstrated, this makes a material difference to the affordances of the media and hence its social impacts. So I want to briefly outline 5 differences and talk about their impacts just very quickly. First of all, new social media like WeChat news accounts are even more transnational than older media insofar as they are accessed from a Chinese platform that allows seamless continuity of use, more or less seamless continuity of use when users travel to Australia. They provide instantaneous real-time links to people and social life in places overseas, and as I've noted, their content is also regulated mainly from the China end, even though they're operating here. Second, thanks to mobile network technologies, this type of social media is far more ubiquitous, more common in daily life than older media. 7 years ago, the theorist I quoted earlier, Greg Noble, suggested that what he called unpanicked multiculturalism may flourish in those parts of everyday life that are located away from the heat of moral panic and media-driven anxieties. Yet in the case I've been speaking about, where ubiquitous social media became host to a racist moral panic, it seemed at times that for the students involved there was no, or precious little, such unmediated part of everyday life, right? How do you get away from media when you always have your phone on with notifications coming in? It's difficult. Third, these new types of media operate in the wider global context of intensified deregulation, commercialisation and digital networking of news media, with attendant risks for the quality of content vis-à-vis journalism's civic function, as has been noted in other contexts. Fourth, as a result of the combination of all of those factors, this type of media is much more readily able to evade legal regulation in the host nation, including evading laws that are aimed at the enhancement of a shared social life in a multicultural society. It's kind of paradoxical because it is a kind of ethnic media, but yet it may, in some cases, undercut multicultural effects. Finally, therefore, in the example I've addressed, the example I've addressed highlights the capacity for some forms of new ethno-transnational media, paradoxically, to undercut those values as much as to enhance them. So I think it would be unproductive as well as inaccurate to fall back on simplistic arguments that ethno-transnational media like WeChat are used in Melbourne are unilaterally harmful. I've underlined several times that's not what I want to say. I'm also not saying that they contribute to a shattered national public sphere or the erosion of social cohesion, as other commentators might have said in other contexts. On the contrary, as I've noted, I would argue that overall the function of such media is positive in enabling the elaboration of minoritarian public spheres and networking local and transnational community within diasporas. However, in some limited cases like the one I've been talking about, these new media ecologies may throw up new challenges for living in diversity. The types of conflict, moral panic and everyday racism seen in some of the representations I've discussed are probably an ineradicable part of everyday life in multiculturalism, and hence something that researchers need to address. However, instead of seeing such conflicts as at root ethnic in nature, as the racist media representations themselves would have us believe, pitting race against race, we need to tease out how such conflicts are driven by complex underlying webs of material and institutional factors. As this example illustrates, these include, among others, the social and economic distribution of resources and power in the site in question, interplays of commerce and culture shaping available ideological frameworks for understanding cultural difference, and the strain on the nation-based civic governance structures that we have in an era when both media and everyday life have become increasingly transnational. Thank you. That's the end.
Thanks, Fran. Good timing. You finished it within an hour. Thank you. We'll now take questions, but I'll just take the chance as the chairman just to ask a very quick one. Now, you talk about the skepticism shown by the students towards the news feed that they read of Mel today.
Yeah.
Do they verify it with other news sources, or do they just dismiss it and say, that's...
Ah, you mean in showing the scepticism, where do they get the scepticism from?
Yeah.
I think I would say, off the cuff, people would read multiple subscription news accounts. So you might see something in Mel today, and then you'd also see a similar story covered somewhere else. So cross-check within the WeChat public accounts.
Platform.
But often you might have seen on some of the slides that they, and you probably know anyway, they the WeChat news accounts will show you a picture of a headline in the Herald Sun. So you feel like you've checked with local media, even if it is the Herald Sun, or it's only part of the thing. The students that I speak to often express the desire to read local news media. I remember I was just looking through transcripts today, and somebody said to me, "Oh, I've got the CNN app and BBC app on my phone, but somehow I always read WeChat." They're kind of wanting to cross-check, but I'm not sure in daily practice whether they do that.
Yeah, because in another parallel research that me and my colleagues are doing, we realized that 90% of those that we interview just rely on WeChat for their newsfeed.
Right, there you go.
As that, it's
like
amazing. They don't read anything outside WeChat.
Who are your interviewees? Who are you working with? Chinese students, right.
In Melbourne. But let's open up the floor to the rest of the audience. Can we take questions? We have one question over there. Gentlemen?
Is that me?
Yes, that's you.
First of all, thank you so much for a very, very fascinating and eye-opening talk, and your research sounds amazing, and I hope it gets published soon.
Thanks.
So, just in regards to what Australian news platforms or news media get, I guess, portrayed on WeChat, do any of the more reputable or more thorough reporting news organisations like The Guardian or Fairfax or ABC News, do any of those organisations publish on WeChat? And if not, is there opportunities for them to look into, bringing in Chinese translators to fill that space?
That's such a good question, and yes, they should. I'm not aware. I mean, I'm interested in following the kind of migrant-produced news, but I haven't seen those. I might be wrong here, but I haven't seen those on WeChat directly. I do know that some of my participants take news from them, like they'd rather read, The Guardian or the ABC and then translate that. So yes, but in my observation, the really popular accounts are taking from more tabloidy sources. That's an impression. I haven't done a statistical study, but that's an impressionistic.
It seems like the tabloid
No, they're not being paid. They're just simply being translated.
Also, Melbourne would go and translate it and put it on WeChat.
Yep. The Herald. I don't think the Herald Sun would know particularly. I mean, I might be wrong, but it doesn't look like it. It's kind of because it's selective too. It's only parts of articles, and yeah.
But there's a kind of commercial process going on, as in it depends.
Yes.
The readers can choose to give money to every piece of news that they read, according to what I know.
Okay.
And it has to be original. So long as it can be a translated piece, or so long as it's original, the readers can actually choose to pay. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, I don't know.
Yeah, but there's a commercial side of the news feed.
Is that widely taken up though? I've just never heard of anyone doing it, but I believe it. It's there.
Is it widely taken? I know a couple of friends of mine that are doing that.
Do it.
So long as whatever they produce is considered original and not from elsewhere, even if they are translated pieces, they're
that's interesting.
Original, they can allow their readership to choose to give money to them.
Okay.
So it's a click, a 1 yuan kind of thing, or 50 cents kind of things, but it kind of accumulate over time. Yeah. Can I have a question over there?
Thank you very much. My humble contribution to following the comment that the gentleman has made is that I'd like to bring the attention that every single thing published on WeChat or similar Chinese sources like that are sanctioned by the Chinese government. And I think other Western or other international media have tried, made similar attempts in publishing translated things on Chinese platforms. But I think so far it is not very successful. And according to my memory, at least the New York Times has been shut down various times for having published things that the Chinese government does not want to see. So my humble comment is that when playing this game, even if we are seated physically in Australia, we are bound by the Chinese rules, and this game is somewhat unfair to the rest of the world.
Thanks for your comment. That's such a good point. Of course, that's one to underline, and that may be very well the reason why this hasn't happened more widely. I have a fieldwork story from one of my participants who she writes for a WeChat news account, and she wanted to cover the recent Four Corners expose of Chinese soft power in Australia. But no, the editor just said, you can't do that. I mean, I think she wanted to write a critique of the Four Corners show, but to even raise the question of those issues is too sensitive. So yeah, very good point.
And very briefly, there appears to be a double standard with regard to the Chinese media in assessing things. For example, if somebody make a criticism about the Chinese government, the immediate response is that it is a humiliation to the Chinese people or whatever. But at the same time, as you have very insightfully mentioned, that Chinese media are doing exactly the same thing to people belonging to the other nations. So I think that there's a double standard.
Thanks.
Right. Further questions? Yes, the gentleman in the middle? Yeah.
Excellent research. I think that a lot of information there that could be applied across not only the Chinese area, but across multiple ethnic groups as well. It's interesting though, because these issues have been raised for many, many years. I mean, Australia is a land of migrants and Waipapi, which is Australia's been in for 60, 70,000 years, but even one day they migrated here, I'm sure. The question I have is the prisms that we look at the research and the findings. There are multiple prisms. There's, of course, if they're relying on the tabloids, I mean, there's a degree of sensationalism, I guess, of course, with regards to what is vetted by the Chinese government. That's another prism. There's also psychosocial prisms as well. I mean, my parents came to Australia back in the 50s, and once again, there are a whole range of issues there. They found comfort in aligning themselves with particular groups. I mean, the youth would do that. Of course, there's different subcultures and so forth. There's also a degree of, you know, realityism, I guess. People love to see reality TV. They know it's rubbish. They know it's absolute rubbish. But there is still that entertainment factor. And I'm just wondering if that psychosocial, behavioural aspect was drawn out of your research.
Yeah, that's interesting. In terms of the psychosocial kind of comfort factor aspect, I mean, yeah, I think that when my participants talk to me about finding that they prefer WeChat media in everyday life, that they don't say it's a psychosocial factor, but yeah, they're talking about comfort, familiarity, certainly a sense of being linked to back home. So if you follow, you follow, following media celebrities from China or the Greater Chinese region, this is comforting. It makes you feel able to live away. So, I mean, these are interesting affordances of new mobile social media, which, you know, media theorists have written about. The second thing you said after the psychosocial factors, just remind me, there was another thing at the end. There was another term. Yeah.
Reality.
Reality. The entertainment aspect, that's it. Yeah, I think probably in general, yeah, there's a lot of kind of funny clickbait, like there's a kind of genre of look what the silly Australians are doing, you know, which is genuinely entertaining, and a whole lot of other stuff that's kind of much more about entertainment. But in these headline news stories, the top one on the feed, they may be, well, no, sometimes they're funny too, but these particular stories I'm talking about they didn't have that I mean, they had it. Entertaining is the wrong word. They had a kind of grab you function, but it was through fear rather than through laughter or something else. So, but yeah, I think in other kinds of stories certainly.
That's also entertaining because we love watching horror movies. We love to be scared.
I don't know. I feel like the fear that people were feeling was bigger than a horror movie. Like it was kind of, I don't want to leave my apartment. Kind of, you know. I think a horror movie you can. It's enjoyable because you really do know it's not real unless you're a little kid. You know, you really do know there's not a monster outside. But the students in this case thought it was real. I mean, they felt under threat. So slightly different genre.
But drawing from the gentleman's comment, I think it's interesting to see that now the consumption, the way that we consume this kind of culture, is unlike what is happening was happening in the 1950s. You know, where it take months for news to get spread. Now you're talking about seconds for news to get to the social media.
Yeah.
So do you see any you know, is it really just pure consumption, or do they actually fit into the identity of the individuals at the end of the day?
Well, I mean, I think that's the big question. What does it mean to travel somewhere for study for a number of years in your formative life period, and have the availability of instantaneous media connectivity with other places, whether it's home or just somewhere else in the diaspora or whatever? I mean, I think that's the big question. I haven't got a clear answer. But I reckon it feeds in. I mean, even the use of Huaran, right, that's got to feed into your sense of yourself as having a particular ethnicity, I think.
Right, right. Can I have a question from John? And then, sorry, your name. Yeah, sorry. I should know your name, but I did. Yeah, 2 questions. We'll take the other 2 questions afterwards. Shall we?
Sure. A terrific project. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Just wondering whether the final conclusion is warranted by the data. Specifically, that we shouldn't see this as an ethnic issue. Let's look to material institutional causes. Because it does seem that there are material and institutional causes for ethnic conflict at present. And ethnicity is itself institutionalised. And the Huaran discourse comes out of the great Zhonghua Minzu that's an institutional statement.
Yep.
And it's being replicated through social media in other forms. So the Huaran, all this sort of stuff, it's all Huaran. That's a conscious conscious, institutional, profit-driven, but also straight-driven notion of ethnicity, which is underlying much of it. So I'm just wondering how it is that you can say we should set aside ethnicity in the institution, but it's embedded so deeply at the present time.
Yes. Yes.
In institutional discourse, which is not multicultural.
No, no, thanks for that. I don't mean to say we should set aside ethnicity. I guess I mean, I spent kind of a couple of months immersed in these horrible kind of media reports, and I was wanting to say, let's set aside the simplistic idea that, you know, whether it's African people want to attack Chinese people or Chinese people don't like Africans, you know, I mean, in a way, you can unpack both those statements and make them be true, but I wanted to say, well, it's not some sort of primordial, essential antipathy between races. As you say, I mean, in saying that the Huairen discourse is an institutionally supported and promulgated and produced discourse, that's different from saying it's an essential ethnic characteristic, right? So, I mean, I agree with you. I guess it's the way I've phrased it has misled, perhaps, and I've erred on the side of de-emphasising the conflict as ethnic in order to draw, you know, heuristically attention to the material, economic, institutional factors, I hope, as well, that really underpin the specifics of the conflict. In my view, it didn't need to happen that way. You know, if the reporting had been different, you know, even if people's phones were stolen by people with different coloured skins than them, it didn't need to be expressed ethnically necessarily. And that was very much the line of the Victoria Police, who like to tamp down, you know, ethnic conflict, I guess. But I think that they're in the name of social stability and harmony, familiar discourses. But, you know, they take that line, and they have a reason for taking that line. Perhaps they take it a little crudely, but I guess I can see what that's about. Okay.
Thank you very much. One of the questions is the scope of your research. Why you choose female Chinese international students? Do you find something like special for them, like in terms of how they consume the media?
Okay. Yeah? Should I answer?
And another, I just come up in my mind. I don't know, like, why reasons like currently China has set up massive connections with African communities. I don't know whether you, like, what's the field which is called World Warrior 2. It happened in Africa. It's been about former Chinese soldiers saving people in Africa, Chinese temporary workers. It just come up to my mind. It's all about the connection between Chinese people and African people.
Yeah. Thank you for those two questions. The first one, why female Chinese students? Yeah, you're right. I didn't focus at all on gender in this paper. I could have, in the sense that I feel that my participant group, being all female, has a specific kind of relationship to urban space and fear, in that the fears of being alone out at night by yourself are gendered fears often. And the reportage I think we saw, you know, it was a Chinese girl student who was attacked. It can be gendered. However, my broader focus on female Chinese students in the wider project, of which this is just one part, is simply because by nationality and gender, they're the largest group in Australia at the moment. So Chinese international students are the largest group of international students by a huge margin. And within that, I think currently around 56% of those students are female. That's despite the birth years of their cohorts being weighted towards male students or male people. About 118 to 100 births in those years were male rather than female. So it's an even bigger discrepancy than you'd expect. So I'm kind of just interested in the broader project of, because I have always been involved in gender studies as well. I'm interested in what does it do, being away from the place of your nationality and citizenship for this period of years, largely in your 20s. What will that do to one as a gendered subject? And as a separate, I haven't talked about that today, but that's the bigger question. What will it do to the way you see yourself as female, feminine, as someone who is probably under some pressure to marry soon after study? Will studying abroad change the way you focus on your future or the way you think of yourself? So that's kind of why the female Chinese students. The second part, yeah, I think the relationships between China and Africa and the way those African nations and the way those are imagined in public culture, Chinese public culture, probably African public culture, popular culture, but among people, those are huge questions, and that's a much larger context than I can deal with in this paper, but there are, you know, scholars working on precisely that. I think it's a great question though, like what is Africanness now meaning to, on a popular level, to audiences and to ordinary people in China? What does it signify? It probably signifies something rather different than it did when I studied in China in the late 80s and early 90s. It meant something then, means something different now. I mean, I don't know how that feeds in. That would be a good project for somebody to address.
Okay, I have two questions. One from gentleman, yeah, then from the lady in black, and the third, the gentleman over there. Okay, can we go in that order, please? Yes, you first.
Sorry for my second question. I realize that your research focused on international students, Chinese international students, and what was said was that 90% may be using WeChat as their sole source of news in Australia, local news in Melbourne. Do you get a sense?
It's actually my
that's
project that
not
we
me.
are doing. Me and my colleagues are doing, not
Apologies.
yeah.
Do you get a sense of what percentage of Chinese in Australia beyond the international students, first generation migrants, who are also using WeChat as their primary source of news?
Do you know the answer to that one? I don't know.
No, we didn't ask the question. We didn't get to that.
Yeah, no, me neither. It must be quite a few though, because just looking at the stats of clicks, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Even if when they try to verify their news, they go to WeChat to verify their news rather than going to BBC website or Guardian to look at news. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you, Fran, for the wonderful presentation. Even though you previously said that gender is not your major concern in this project, but you mentioned that you get this sense of that the female participants, they have a very gendered fear in the urban space of Melbourne. And I can't help but link these cases that happened in Melbourne with a very high-profile law court case that happened recently in the United States about a girl who was Zhang Ying.
Okay.
Yeah, her name, and so she was allegedly harmed and killed by a university PhD candidate, a Caucasian male, and so I get, and from these, if we look at all these cases together, the cases that happened in Melbourne about female students' phone getting stolen by African American men, the Chinese girl whose life was taken by a Caucasian male, and then you see the comments after the comments that follow these incidents, and you see that people have been almost constructing not just the race, but also the nation. They're constructing Western countries as a dangerous place, whereas in contrast, China is much safer. You wouldn't even, we know that it's not true because these things of similar severity happen in China as well. They don't get reported as much because it happens so frequently. So it's not as newsworthy as similar things that happen overseas. So I seem to get the sense that these media stories, they don't just construct Chinese people, but they also construct China as a much safer place to live. My observation.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. By implication, they do. And certainly speaking with my participants, who I have to say, I mean, since, as I said in the talk, in 2016, this series of events sparked off a new kind of fear for these young women of being in urban space. That's continued up until the present, and there's other cases now that are circulating on WeChat. It seems to me, maybe because I've got a big group of participants in the northern suburbs, but particularly up there, of like street assaults and violent, not even robberies, just attacks. So, and speaking to them about it, their immediate kind of thing to say is, oh, it's not like this in China. I'm not scared like this back home. So I think the effect for the readers and the audience and the people who are the consumers of these messages and reports has the effect of, yeah, like reflexively constructing the Chinese nation in a certain way from a distance. You're right. I mean, and I'm very interested in that effect in general of being away. Like how do you then reflexively reconstruct China from outside? That's an element of that. Thank you.
Yep. The question, the gentleman?
Hi, I'm Chen Liao from Sydney University. Thank you for the presentation. It's very, very wonderful. And I have two questions. The first one is, how did the exaggerate news, if not say fake news, affect the subscribers' trust in the official account and its content? Did they unfollow the account, or did they still trust it for some kind of news resource? And the second question is, are there any counterpart social media news accounts run by other ethnicities in Melbourne, like say the Indians and the Vietnamese? And because the gentleman mentioned actually this double standard with regard to the Chinese country or Chinese authority back in Beijing. How did the, like say, Indians and the Vietnamese report about news like that? Do they have this kind of double standard? Or are they, like say, tracked or censored by the Australian government?
Okay, thank you. The first question, how did the exaggerated news affect people's trust in the platforms? I mean, I think it did a little bit. I mean, those readers who were inclined to be critical after the panic had died down a bit became more critical of the more sensationalised accounts. And yeah, like I said, some people would tell me, don't look at Mel today. You know, so some people don't want to look at it because it's seen as a poor quality platform. However, you know, its subscriptions are still very high and it's still one of the most popular. So I don't know really in the long term what effect that lack of trust may have. In relation to similar platforms for other ethnicities, I'd love to know the answer to that question. I just don't know. I must speak to other scholars who are researching with different groups, particularly of students. I mean, yeah, the Indian students would be a good group to look at, or any other group of international students, and how they use social media to kind of deal with or kind of process local events. It's a great question. I'll try and find out. Thank you.
Maybe in a second.
Yeah, so mine just sort of follows on from that. Talking about fear, there's a lot of literature in social media work around information overload and how this becomes techno stress on individuals, and then coping strategies or mechanisms that they're implementing. Did anything sort of come up in your research that you're sort of seeing, I guess, in the same thing like trust or disconnecting for a little while?
Not that I noticed, but I should ask that question. Like, I mean, it's a good question. I feel like in the moment of the panic, which is the one I'm really focusing on, people were so scared that they used these media more, just to desperately try and find what's going on, what's true, what's not true, where's it safe, where's it dangerous, what's happening to people. Like, it really was a panic. So that's probably not the moment to look at. Maybe when it dies down a little, or people are not so directly afraid, might be the time when they think, hang on, I need to take a step back. But no one has told me that they're using it less. I mean, I do have participants who don't want to use WeChat at all. In particular, a couple who've been here for years, 5 or 6 years, don't use it. They've gone onto Facebook and other kinds of social, just replaced it with other social media. But it produces a different worldview, which is why they did it. So yeah, there's choices to be made around.
I guess also the connection with back home would probably feel cool, wouldn't it? As people
Yes. Yeah.
Despite the fear, they've got that much more cool.
Oh yeah.
mechanism.
I mean, I think asking people not to use WeChat at all is impossible, really.
We're speaking for ourselves.
Speaking for ourselves. But the news accounts, I mean, you could unsubscribe from one of them. That's not such a big deal, maybe. Pick a better one, yeah.
Question?
First of all, thank you. Fascinating research. Thing is, like, when it kind of like kept ringing to me like those like particular WeChat platforms are like acting as like as a filter bubble to those to your participants, and like emphasizing those stories like in a constant loop feedback loop. My question is like, how aware were they that like they're like in sort of like filter bubble? They're like most imminent news stories are not as imminent for like the rest of the population surrounding them and the population back home.
Yeah. That's a really good question. Actually, the stories were pretty imminent for the population back home in the sense their parents were reading them too.